Hello and welcome to Dateline New Haven on WNHH-FM, New Haven's home for community radio. I'm Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make our community tick. Well, some of the headlines that are on our mind these days have been coming out of Atlanta and Memphis. It involves policing, and they have a lot to do with how we police in New Haven as well and around the country. And to help us make sense of what's happening there and what it means for us here is WNHH-FM's criminal justice expert. Our resident policing expert, John Velleca, retired New Haven police chief and assistant chief, and a long career in policing, and he's also a professor at Albertus Magnus College. And John, are you still sergeant at arms in the state senate?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Now, how many senators you been rounding up these days?
None.
Okay.
None. Zero.
It doesn't sound too hard.
Yes, it does.
Although you've done gang task work before.
Yeah,
so
right. Yeah, that's a formidable gang for sure.
John, welcome to WNHH-FM's Dateline New Haven. It's great to have you back.
It's always great to be here. You know that.
So the big issue, obviously, is Tyree Nichols. Yeah. There's an easy way to talk about this and a not as easy way. So let's get the easy way part out of the way first. People are they saw that video. Our minds have been blown that these officers that stopped him for maybe suspicion of a traffic violation beat the crap out of him. He runs for his life, and then they get him. He's calling out for his mom, and then they just continue beating him, and he dies from his injuries. What was that about? What did you think when you saw that?
Well, obviously I thought what everybody else thought. It was brutal, obviously, and way out of line. But you know what? Those units, they're
part of a unit called Scorpion. It's
right.
An acronym for a group that, because of the increase in violent crime in Memphis, more extreme than here, but it's happened around the country since about 3 years ago. The police chief said, okay, I hear you. I'm going to have this group go around and stop people who look like they're up to no good and see if bigger things are happening to cut down the crime.
Right. Those units they're fueled by pretextual motor vehicle stops, basically. And that's pretty much what this was. Something like, a minor infraction just to make a stop and investigate
Was
further.
there even one here? What was the minor infraction?
Well, it gets to the point where it's reckless driving, and that's all on the perception of the police officer. So it's kind of a catch-all. It's like our interfering charge. Remember how we talk about the interfering charges?
Do you think he was? Was he?
I didn't see enough of the video
Not
prior
to
to the stop.
it, but I haven't heard any evidence that there was anything going on.
I believe that they said that one article I read said that there was not a lot of probable or any probable cause determined to stop him. So, but they made the stop, so they had to make the stop for some reason, you would think. But I didn't see that. Put it that way in the video.
And boy, what I didn't realize till reading more about it, because they lied about it first. The department said that there was a fight. Yeah. After he had acted badly, and then he got hurt. I mean, it wasn't a fight. He got stopped for no reason. And the first time they started hitting him,
right?
And then he got away, and then they beat him so badly he died.
Yeah. It looks like they tried to get him out of the car. Obviously, we need cause to get you out of your car. Now, if you're going to go by what you're supposed to do to remove somebody from the car, you're under the belief that there's a weapon somewhere at arm's reach that they're going to do damage to you. And the officer sees you're compounding that with resistance. It always
was there a
weapon?
Up. Was there resistance?
No. There was. The only resistance would have been something along the lines of passive resistance, not getting out of the car. But then he did concede to get out of the car. And then it was just an old, just an assault. Long story short.
So what? One thing I don't get yet. We haven't heard yet. Why did they do it?
Well,
why did they just beat up this innocent guy and kill him?
Well, that lends to the culture of those units, right? Within policing, there's a culture within the culture of policing that exists within these units, and they're notoriously they're riddled with misconduct, right? And that's why we tend to move away from these. You talk about the street crime unit in New York, the stop and frisk issues, the crash unit in Los Angeles,
and the mayor Adams said we can do it better,
right? So, and then you have the Scorpion unit, and there's
we had the beat down posse, which wasn't the same thing.
Not the same thing, but I've been
beating up.
I've been right, absolutely. I've been part of those units. I've managed those units, and I've organized and put those units into action. Right at one point in my career, and they operate differently.
What was your unit called?
When I first started out, it was street crime, and then when I managed it, I believe. I don't want to say IDNet. It was before I
remember IDNet.
I think it was like
sort of
the G unit, the gun unit, whatever they called it.
I remember
like
IDNet.
That.
You managed IDNet?
I was not in IDNet. That was Jeff Hoffman. Late Jeff Hoffman handled that. I did the gun unit, which was the G unit. They gave it that name. And then when I redid it, I did it as part of a partner with TNU, but it was just simply the street
Tactical
crime unit.
narcotics unit.
Right,
Remember,
and then
we had a scandal with corruption, and you were charged, and you made the unit clean in the sense that you weren't going around beating up people, and you weren't
Right.
stealing money like they had.
Absolutely.
But are you saying there's still something endemic to those units?
Well, I tell you.
And what are these units? These units where you're in plain clothes and you stop people
Right, these units
for
are-
small seeming offenses to see if there's something bigger?
Well, what they're really charged with is what we call hotspot policing, right? They're supposed to identify areas that are high in crime, and then go into those areas and try and enforce any kind of action they can, any kind of law they can, whether it's on the upper end or the lowest end. And you're just supposed to initiate action and see essentially where that brings you. But I'll tell you an interesting story about the culture within these units, right? So this unit is called Scorpion, right? And
Just by the name.
well, that's what we're going to talk about. So, Bridgeport Police Department had a notorious unit that was problem is called TNT, right? Miami Police Department, TNT, same thing, Tactical Narcotics Team. Los Angeles, Crash, right? So, you could tell almost the way these units are about to operate just by the naming of these units, right? So, when I put TNU together, I went to Chief Lewis at that time, and I said, you know what? Let's just call it TNT because that's
TNT?
TNT, right? And he said,
Tactical.
Tactical Narcotics Team,
Uh-huh.
and he said, absolutely not. And I said, why? He said, well, what is the message you're sending by naming your unit
After
after
explosive.
dynamite, after
Yeah.
something explosive? And I remember him telling me that if that's the way I thought, then he'd reconsider. I was the man for the job for this unit. And I said, well, I understand what you're saying. I agree with you. Let's rename it. He said, call it TNU. I understand the tactical end. I understand the narcotics end. But you're a unit, and we don't want to send out the wrong impression. And that always kind of stuck with me. So if you look at these units, they're notoriously named something, how should I say, aggressive or something,
Yeah.
something to that matter, right? And that's endemic of how the officers
So
in those
what happened
units
to you
think.
when you look back? Do you think TNU was the right thing to
I
do?
do.
You
I
think
do.
the culture was not a problem?
I think the culture lies with the selection of the officers and the leadership in the unit, right? But I also think that if I put that unit set forth as TNT, a different type of officer would have wanted to come into that unit, right? I wouldn't have had the veteran officers who were parents. And
What
who,
about the fundamental question? So we go back and forth a lot in our city, in our country. New York's been the classic case of when you stop people and why. And Rebecca Sweeney Goddard says supervision is key. So that's an important thing
Right.
for us to focus here. And you did. I mean, we didn't have any problems when you did that.
Right.
I'm wondering about an underlying issue because IDNet, the problem was, okay, you go out there, we're stopping everybody for everything. We're
Yeah.
going to show this order. And the neighbor's asking you. When we did IDNet, Dwight Kensington was asking us. They said, it's one of these periods when violence is out of control. It was 08, 07. And they said, and so there was this new version of community policing that was no longer solve the problem without arrests and rack up the arrests
Right.
to show that we're out there. And you get applauded by some people who don't cause trouble. They would say, hey, you're out there. You're not going to let the person loiter. You're not going to let that person have an expired license plate. You're not going to have that person drive like a nutcase and not look out for the kids. And we don't want that. So you're showing there's no bar, sort of zero tolerance. But then there's another end of it where, and also you get praised. So the officers get praised by very honest supervisors who say, hey, Paul, it's like they're showing good, not aggressive. They say good, proactive,
Assertive.
a proactive initiative. They took the initiative. They saw, and often it's true. They saw if you look in the other tinted windows or something, there is a gun there sometimes.
Mhm.
There's no question that they more often get illegal guns off the street by stopping someone for some other reason or a pretext. The problem, right, is that all of a sudden people, it's like an armed camp in your community, right?
Right.
And again, I'm not faulting an officer. It's just that so I'm wondering whether the culture also has to do with you seeing people as targets. And like I remember there was one officer who became a chief who told the New Hallville cops, round up everyone and their mama. Because we
Right.
got to get our numbers up to Shadow Hallville. We're stopping people. And this was as recently as a few years ago.
Yeah.
And there were women going to church, just getting stopped on their way to church 3 times a week.
Right.
Do we want that? Or is that part of
No,
the culture
no,
problem? So
no.
how do you avoid that?
Well, here's the thing. When you get these units, of course, you're gonna ask them to go out there and see what they could do to fight crime. However, a knee-jerk reaction to the public, whether they're a proponent of community policing or not, when there are murders and there are violence happening in your neighborhood every day, the knee-jerk reaction of the people in the community are say, lock everybody up,
Save
do
us.
something,
Yeah,
right?
do something.
You have to be able to withstand that as a police officer, and you have to still understand. You have to understand the law constitutionally, right? Which is a lot of our baseline officers don't. knowing when you can stop somebody, what the reasons for that is, when you should stop somebody, even bringing the moral aspect of it. Maybe somebody is in a minor violation, but they're with their children, or they're heading to work, or they're dropping them off at the bus. Maybe that's not the time to enforce that law, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and I get what you're saying about, okay, sometimes when you look through a car, there's a gun there, and okay, that's a good seizure. But let's talk about, out of 100 times you make that stop, what is there a gun there? Maybe once or twice? Now you've disenfranchised 98 people to get 2 guns. It's not worth it. It's just simply not worth it. The breakdown in trust.
So
is
that's
not worth
interesting.
it.
So now what you and Rebecca talk, and I totally agree with you, Rebecca, that it starts with supervision who you hire.
Right.
You talked about naming it so we're not out there as sort of like a gang.
Right.
But what about this other question you're raising now? I think it's not so easy. I really feel for the cops and for the neighbors because of these conflicting impulses that
Right.
you have a sixth sense. Like, cops aren't dumb, right? So many cops
absolutely.
we know do know that someone's up to something. They can just
Sure.
tell by reading the street, right? So, like, I'm thinking of one officer I know who got in a lot of trouble because he did some wrong things, but he really knew how to read the street, and he would know somebody was up to something. But then there were issues of how that stop was made, and then, of
Right.
course, there's the racial issue, right? So, like, if you know that there's a neighborhood where only one kind of race hangs out, and you see some white guy look strung out hanging the black neighbor, you know he might not be up to any good. But
Right.
or the black person going, the white neighborhood always gets harassed, even if it turns out they live there,
Right,
you
right,
know,
right.
or just because they had a nice car. There's a state
Yeah.
Supreme Court justice who got stopped who was black because he had his BMW, but he had sweats to go get it washed, and that doesn't look right.
Right.
So how do you balance that, like, instinct that cops as human beings kind of need to call on? You need to call on your being able to read reality. And yet you have to worry about what you mentioned about safeguards, the real reason for stops, the constitutional reasons.
Right. So I don't agree with the sixth sense of a police officer. I don't believe that exists. I believe that when you see an officer who can read the street, that's because they've got a lot of experience and they're drawing from that, which is experience is knowledge, and knowledge gives them the ability. It's not a sixth sense. They're not special. They don't know anything that the normal person doesn't know. They've just been involved in more. Right. So that being said, if you have knowledge from your experience, you need to know the other end of the knowledge, and that's the constitutional knowledge. It's part of your job, right? And you don't stop somebody just because you think. Now, you may think somebody has committed a crime. That's not enough to stop anybody. And if you know you can't do that, then you shouldn't be a police officer, because there's a test.
But what about when you get rewarded by
that's the problem.
supervisors who are responding to legitimate concerns from the neighborhood, as you pointed out, and say you've had good proactive policing?
Right. Well,
You stopped someone who you were allowed to stop that person because their tail light was out, and you got the gun, you had the fight,
Right. Well, the response has to be as legitimate as the complaint, right? And you need your officers to think more holistically, not just one-dimensionally. Go into a situation and say, okay, is there a violation? It's not as simple as that, and it shouldn't be as simple as that. We're dealing with people. There's a human element there. Like I said, if somebody's got an expired registration sticker and they're driving their 2 kids to school and they're heading off to work, one of their 2 or 3 jobs, is that really what
How do
you're
you
going to
know they're not going to their second job in the middle of the night at Dunkin' Donuts when it's 1 a.m. on Kensington Street?
You don't.
So do you stop them?
If they have you're saying if I know it, sure, you stop them, get their story, and if it's, if you believe in that, use your discretion and make a decision. You don't always have to enforce the law. I mean, that's just the reality of the situation. Sometimes the smaller infractions, you're gaining more, right, by not enforcing the law.
Right. There's also that issue that people get all these expensive debts because the way our court system deals with it, and then they get deeper in a hole.
And then they hate the police, and then
Yeah.
that's the problem. And then you may not that you. It's not even that you need somebody to give you information before, although that does matter. But at the same time, we're not here to do that.
Well, as Eric Adams right in New York, he was a retired police officer. He says he was against the stop and frisk the way it was being racially imbalanced, but he's bringing back stop and frisk. Said, I believe we could do it in a way that isn't racially imbalanced, and he's responding to conservatives in the city who basically white people want to be protected from privileged white people want to get black protected from people they're scared of. But is he right, or is it just can't be done?
I think that you can do police work, and you could do things like stop people based on reasonable suspicion, to interview them and determine whether a crime is about to be committed or not, without violating the rights or bringing in a racial element into it. The problem is that it's labor intensive, let's say, and a lot of officers don't want to be bothered with that aspect of the job, right? Now, if you need numbers, which is, we've talked about this before, a lot of everything, it wasn't until I got to the chief's level where I understand that everything is driven by numbers, right? Every dollar I get is driven by numbers. So if I need numbers, I'm going to send my officers into the most densely populated area in the city, right? Because they're going to have the more opportunities to enforce laws. Those happen to be our black and brown neighborhoods. So, and our impoverished neighborhoods. So that's the whole thing. Can you withstand the money, but to do what's right, or do you need the money so much you're willing to do what's
and
wrong?
And I feel
morally,
for this police chief they brought into Memphis. Black woman, was not from there.
Yep.
She said, "You got to help us clean up," and she felt both the reality and the concerns of Black Lives Matter movement, and sometimes from the same human beings. The concern of, oh my God, because they have a lot of murders in Memphis, and say, oh my God, you got to do something about this. She said, I hear you hear Scorpion. What should she have done?
I think she did everything that she could have possibly done. I personally, if it were me, I would have disbanded Scorpion before they had an opportunity to do this. I don't agree with those units. I don't think there's a place for them.
But you had TNU. You
did.
Just didn't call Scorpion, and they weren't jerks.
Well, TNU is different than Scorpion. TNU was investigative detectives with narcotics work. It wasn't a roll-through, rip-and-grip type unit.
Uh-huh. So rip and grip is kind of the term of art?
Yeah, well, you stop somebody and you're ripping and gripping their pockets, not necessarily literally.
Right, so TNU is investigative. That's different.
TNU was made up of detectives.
But IDNet was rip and grip.
I don't want to say that because I was in charge of it, because I don't really
know.
Be
honest here. See what you learned from being a cop.
Well, I'll put it this way.
As soon as they did, I said, how is this community policing? I remember arguing with Rob Smuts, who's this community in charge, he was chief administrator of us. I said, community policing was supposed to be arrest people less as a last resort,
right?
And work with people to find out the roots of crime and solving problems. With IDNet, you're bragging about how many people you can stop and get for small offenses. How is that community policing?
That's not community policing. That's not policing. That's lazy officer policing.
But you were in charge of that.
I was not in charge of IDNet.
Oh, I thought you said you were.
No, Jeff Hoffman was in charge of IDNet. Pete Reichert actually was in charge of IDNet. Jeff was just the sergeant in there. I took
and
over.
Again, we're not faulting individuals.
Yeah,
They're taking orders what the community wants and what the department thinks we do.
Yeah.
So what do you think about IDNet?
Well, I wasn't a proponent of IDNet at that time. I was asked to be the supervisor in IDNet, and I turned it down. I was just, it had nothing to do with the unit. I was content in my patrol position at that time. When I rebirthed the street crime unit as part of a tandem with the TNU, they were a ancillary investigative unit. They weren't a grip and rip unit. In other words, they weren't charged with going in there and stopping everybody. They were charged with going to the detective, getting a list of people they needed to look at and for their investigations, and then trying to gather information on them because the detective was overwhelmed. So, like if I were investigating you, and we identified 4 or 5 people that you worked with, well, then that unit will go out and investigate each one of those, just because the detective can't do all that on his own, right? And if you remember, Chris Sr., I believe, got into a shooting doing that. He was part of that street crime unit. Do you remember that? Mm-hmm. So that person that he got into the shooting with was somebody who was involved in the investigation. They were charged with surveillance, and then the shooting happened. But it wasn't a unit where you arbitrarily go out to hotspots, so to speak, and look to see what you can get. Go fishing, so to speak.
I'll go fishing hotspot. And we're fishing for some answers to deeper questions beyond the obvious injustice of what happened in Memphis about how law enforcement should do its job when police are being buffeted by sometimes contradictory demands. Mm-hmm. And we're doing that on Dateline New Haven. Our guest is John Velleca, the criminal justice / policing expert of our radio station. So, John, an interesting twist on the Tyree Nichols case here. There's an issue you and I disagree with each other about respectfully, and that's speed cameras. So for decades now, New Haven's lawmakers, most recently Roland Lamar, state rep, have tried to get the state permission, but I guess we do have permission. I guess they had a state bill to promote and fund speed cameras where we just set up places where people drive like maniacs. It's gotten worse. We had, I think, a third increase, if it was, a few years of pedestrians getting killed and cyclists. And we're hearing that a lot from neighbors, especially poor neighbors, saying, stop these people speeding. So we set up once in a while a crew at a random place to enforce the laws and kind of stop people for bad driving. And instead of but the speed cameras would be set up so you get their license plate. So if they're driving bad, you get billed. For years, that's been killed. Year after year at the Capitol, they say, black and brown communities say this is going to be used more against us. Mm-hmm. Some of them say, although some of the demands come from those communities, civil liberties people say, you're guilty until innocent under this, and it's not going to be done well. It's just going to be a moneymaker. This year, Tyree Nichols entered the debate. They said, look, when police are arbitrarily stopping for traffic violations, it's not always perfect, consistent. Sometimes other things are playing. They can turn into these horrible incidents. Horrible for the cop, horrible for the victim. Right. So with speed cameras, it's just everybody speeding. You'd get it so much more efficiently get everyone who's speeding or driving like a crazy person, and that's that. And you don't have the human element of coming in and it could turn into something horrible or be arbitrary. They're saying this becomes a civil rights and civil liberties reason to put in the cameras. What do you think, John?
I don't know. I'm not a proponent in surveillance in our communities. I've never been. Dare I say that and have Justin Elker call me a dinosaur like he did last time. However, what I can tell you is this. We sat here, it was a year ago, and we debated the surveillance cameras going in, and I told you...
That's a separate issue.
Right.
So city got hundreds of surveillance cameras. You're saying it's not a separate issue?
It's a tangential issue.
Okay,
right?
what those cameras were, they just set them up in places just to watch all the crime, and they say,
and
the reason Bridgeport and Waterbury and Hartford were solving more homicides was that they had all this video evidence that's useful.
Completely unfounded. Second, I tell you, you got the cameras in. We've had 5 homicides, the most we've had in January since 2011, since I was there. How many have you solved with the camera? 0.
They actually said they do get some quick license plate.
Okay, wait a second. They get pictures. All right, I got pictures too. I got license plates too. I got descriptions. We never made a case on all that. We never made a case.
Right, you don't necessarily make the case, but you find the person sooner, and that's helpful.
Well, I'm not. How do you know if you found the person sooner? How do you? What are you comparing that to? You're saying
if you didn't have a license plate from the speed
the car may not have the car. The chances are. Listen, we're in New Haven. How many times I've gotten a license plate and then come back to the car, was unregistered, was a misuse.
But if they get it immediately, they can look for that car around town.
Right, they could feed it into their LPN, and then bang, they get.
And if we actually watch,
and how many times does that happen? Now we're getting into the whole thing of, do I stop you because the tinted windows under the tinted windows is a gun? But how many?
No,
people...
I'm talking real time. They're saying now that we've got hundreds of new cameras being
monitored.
monitored.
Let me see that happen, and that's great in theory. Is it happening? No, it's not happening.
They did have an arrest recently where they told us
how many
quickly.
Times?
Okay.
Out of how many times?
So
my point to this is, when we're going to get to the point where every inch of our city is covered by a camera.
I think it's happening
for some reason, right? For some reason. So you're going to tell me if we have a speed camera up, okay, and somebody commits a felony, we're not going to enforce that felony because it's on a speed camera? Of course we are. Now
this might be beyond our technological knowledge here. I thought it's going to be pointed right at the intersection, right at the cars.
Could be. Well, what happens if that camera catches a felony, a criminal felony without a motor vehicle violation? What do you do with that information? Do you not act on it? Can't not act on it. Of course you're going to act on it.
But we already have those cameras up everywhere, John.
Well, I'm quite sure that those cameras are going to go into areas that are not covered right now by the cameras that exist.
Right.
We won't have dual coverage.
So they said the reason. Oh, they did say the way they're now talking. They refined the program. They say they're going to put it based on the data. Where there's the worst driving, the most crashes.
I know. That's great. That's a good political dance. I understand that. But listen, it probably will follow that data, okay? But I can assure you, I'll bet anything, if there was a crime camera that's covering that area already, they're going to move that crime camera, put it somewhere else.
And you don't think it's possible to make it not like a crime camera? Just make it. Just take license plate numbers.
Absolutely. Do I think the cameras will have that capability?
So you're the one who talked about what if something like when I said they did cite the cameras recently, you said, well, that was just one out of how many?
Yeah, right.
Let's put down the reverse on you, John. What if you have this just pointed at the license plates, and that you're worried that once in a year there might be a felony right at that intersection, right where the light is, right where the camera's pointed at car license plates. Mm-hmm. And so how often is that going to be? Versus how many people might get caught or billed who might be killing kids or running over seniors or cyclists.
All right. Well, if you were to ask me, if we were to invade people's rights and put them under surveillance and catch them once out of 100 years, that's one time too many.
Because I agree. We shouldn't invade their rights. But how does it invade their rights? When you're driving a car, like if you have a gun, you have a permit for a gun.
Right.
You don't have the right to then just go shoot up a school.
No, of course not.
So the camera will catch you there. If I drive a car, I don't have a right to run through the light at 80 degrees and 80 miles per hour and, swerve at the last second and not look what I'm doing while I'm talking. So
sure, yeah.
Why? How does that violate my rights to have my license plate taken when it's shown I did that?
I think it's in that one particular instance, maybe it doesn't violate your rights, and you weigh that against the safety of the community. But I think when you start bringing cameras in for every small little violation that the communities complain about, I think you're opening a door where you can't close it.
I agree with that, but we're going a little bit against the tide of history, because as Mayor Elker said, that's over. People have decided we want the cameras in society, and they are everywhere. People have their home cameras, the Ring cameras. I share your concerns about civil liberties. Again, I'm wondering if we're doing too much of a blanket here with the speed cameras.
I think that the police officer, at least the administrative police officer in me, says, is there another way I can do the same thing?
Is there?
I think there is. I think that if you're proactive with your motor vehicle enforcement, now I don't know what Carl's doing.
Oh, we're back
He
to
may
now.
be doing that.
Proactive, but we said earlier that we got to watch out for that.
Proactive motor vehicle enforcement, which you're instructing the officers that we're not using as pretextual stops. So in other words, if I pull you over for a red light, the questioning doesn't turn to where you're going, where you're coming from, what's this, what's that, you got anything in the car. We're talking about the red light infraction, and that's it.
So you were worried about the video used to get a license plate capturing unintentionally a felony and being used. How will this be different from you're stopping the person in the car and you do notice there's a gun on the ground?
That's a different story.
You're
That's
watching the bags of crack.
That's a different story. But to be honest with you, I
was a
pretty assertive police officer. Okay, I've never stopped a car where the gun was up on the dash and we made an arrest. Every gun I've taken out of a car was found after a line of questioning and removal from the person in the car and search of the car.
And you're saying don't do that questioning.
And I'm saying, right, I'm saying if you're going to do motor vehicle enforcement, do motor vehicle enforcement. Okay,
but why not?
Don't go
combine?
back to because that's my point. If you could combine that and stay constitutionally sound, okay. But a lot of times we can't, and we're fishing, and that's what I think is the dangerous thing.
So don't go fishing.
Right. When I see officers pull somebody over, and rip. When I see somebody when I see somebody getting pulled over for a motor vehicle violation, and then the officer starts in the line of question, where you going, where do you live, where you going from, where do you work, all this other stuff, right? Why? Why are we doing that? Why are we putting people under that kind of interrogation? Because that's exactly what that is. Because you're not asking questions just to wonder. You're interrogating somebody because you're looking for a guilty response.
You earlier said, well, if we start doing cameras for every little thing people complain about, then there's no end to it. I agree with that.
I think we have to have
is
administrators.
This every little thing, or do we have a real problem with out-of-control driving that's really ending people's lives or debilitating them?
I get it.
The old guy who was walking on College Street. I mean, it's just...
Right. We do have a problem with
Sherman
it.
Park.
But here's the thing. As administrators, police administrators especially, you have to at some time have the guts to stand up and say, no, we're not going to do that because we're going to view the rights of society holistically. We're going to look at everybody.
I love that, but aren't we now forgetting the rights of people to walk on the street and ride their bikes?
Well, weigh the rights.
Or not get hit.
No, I understand that too, but what do we do? Do we violate the rights of more people, I guess, to take care of a small majority? Right? Is that what we're doing? Okay, the people in Dwight Kensington, there's a problem there with dealing drugs. So you know what? We're going to put the whole city in surveillance, and that's it. And that's all there is to it. We're going to roll drug units into every neighborhood just because Dwight Kensington. We're punishing everybody for a specific problem. I don't agree with that. My personal opinion. I don't agree with cameras everywhere. I do agree. Listen,
where would you support cameras?
I used cameras many times in my career. If we had an area that was characterized by gang activity, we documented it. We wrote for a warrant. We got a poll camera or surveillance. If there's cause in a specific area, I'm all for it. But to arbitrarily stack cameras because the number's gone up in a certain area for motor vehicle violations, then what happens? Okay, so we stopped the problem at El Grasso in Washington, right? And then at Congress in the Boulevard. Now we have a problem. Okay, so we put another camera there. Then 6 months later, we have a problem here. We put another camera over there. Now, okay, are we moving the camera? After the Washington Boulevard clears up and there's no more violations there, are we taking that camera down?
I got to be honest, I think you make a lot of sense, John. And, I usually am so much in your camp, but I'm having such a hard time imagining in a real way losing anything and not gaining a lot by just getting the video of the license plate when they drive like nuts. That I don't see any other way to really stop it.
Yeah,
we tried everything. We set up like that
no,
way.
We
set up on Sergeant Drive. We started up on Long Wharf Drive on July 4th, and then they go somewhere else.
Right, I understood. I can tell you why we haven't tried everything. And it's no fault of the police chief because you know how I think about Carl. I think he's doing a fantastic job. I think that simply with what's going on in the city of New Haven, all right, there's simply not enough police officers to do what we need to do when it comes to motor vehicle. But they're too busy handling calls.
I thought you used to say we didn't need more. We just got to use them better.
Well, what I said before was the way we're running the place now, no, we don't need 440 cops. If we're going to be reactive, go to number one calls and no walking beats and things like that, we could definitely get by with 300 cops, 250 even, right? But if we want all these peripheral things, these motor vehicle violations, walking beats, and all these things, that takes more cops and takes more money. That's what I've always said. Mm-hmm. That was in the context of the conversation that we're spending too much money. Remember, $11 million where it was in overtime, it's no good. And what I said was we could cut the overtime, but you're not going to get the services, right? And that's all there is to it. Now,
and Harry says criminals have rights too. Don't gang members deserve privacy? In your argument, you were saying earlier, you have to have enough evidence for suspicion that you would be able to obtain a warrant, and that anyone you have evidence against of criminal activity, then the laws you're allowed to surveil.
I guess Harry sums up. I think that the only way the government, which is what we are, should put you under surveillance is if there is cause to do that. And it's got to be an articulable cause, and you have to show that cause. That's my personal opinion. I don't think we should arbitrarily get into people's lives. We've talked about this before. I think less policing is better, not more at this time. I think people are tired of the police being in their lives.
All right, and we're talking about that on Dateline New Haven. New Haven's home for community radio, WNHH-FM, New Haven's 103.5 FM, live stream, newhavenevent.org. John Velleca, who is the police and criminal justice expert of this radio station. Cop City, that's not what people who want to build it call it.
Right.
Atlanta, 85 acres of forest. There's actually urban forest in Atlanta. I never knew that. And unlike almost anywhere else in America, nature is right near the poorest neighborhood.
Yeah.
An 85-acre forest on historic tribal land next to a black neighborhood, low income in Atlanta. They've approved state and federal money, state and local money to destroy the forest and make it into the replica of a city. And it'll be a training area for police on how to do crowd control. This passed, but for the last year, there's been a protest. People are in the trees trying to stop and take it down. Yeah. And then 2 weeks ago, there was an exchange of gunfire between one of the protesters and a cop. The protester died. The cop got hit in the stomach. He's in serious condition in the hospital. The governor has called a state of emergency, sending in the National Guard to clear it out. What's your take on this incident?
Yeah, I was reading about that last night. I guess yesterday, the day before, they cleared everybody out of there. I think that goes along with what I've been saying. I don't think that we've gotten to the point in policing where we don't really pay much attention to the realities of what the community want. We're good at appeasing them, telling them what they need to hear, right? Giving them hollow promises. And I think you just need to weigh that. It's a great facility. Something that, my God, I would love to have all that stuff to train with. But at what cost? That's the whole thing. You're going to turn yourself, you're going to disenfranchise your department with a community where relations are already strained. I mean, and that's like putting the nail in the coffin almost. I mean, is there another place we could do it? Maybe not as big. I would look for alternatives, to be honest with you. I don't agree with it.
What would you do when the protest is happening? I remember you were in charge of the department. You're in part, if I'm not mistaken, you're in Occupy New Haven,
right
on the green.
Yep.
That was so complicated because at first, New Haven's place, we love protests. Then all of a sudden it got to be kind of dangerous. There could be fires. It was unhealthy. Most people
they're threatening police officers.
Yeah. They threatened police officers. Everyone called the Jewish police officer whose parents were Holocaust survivors, called him a Nazi because things could burn down and the public couldn't use the park.
Right.
It got dystopian. What was your experience from that you could bring to situations like Cop City?
Oh, well, I'll tell you what. I think Rebecca's listening. If she hears, I think she might have been involved in that on the lieutenant or sergeant level.
I felt so bad that day for the officers when I saw and these weren't even people from New Haven. I remember when they had meetings, they would make fun of what a dangerous neighborhood the Hill is and everything. It was kind of there were beautiful things that started to occupy about the 1%. By the time it got to be more than a week here, it got to be like Lord of the Flies.
Right.
And a lot of drug use and mental health stuff too.
Absolutely, yeah. It got overrun with that at one point, but I think what the officers did in the uniform level, the lower levels, sergeants and lieutenants and the officers themselves, they established a relationship with the people that were there, and I think that went, when we got a little bit of resistance, but a lot of times, if we asked them to do certain things to see certain behavior, they did. Right, they did, and that was out of because
Rebecca says we did not handle Occupying the Green correctly. I had a good relationship with the occupiers. I wonder what Rebecca thinks they did wrong and who we were. Was it? I mean, the government officials had good impulses at first to want to let them there, but then you couldn't control the situation. So I don't know what else the police should have done differently. I don't know what else I'm interested in, Rebecca, if you want to keep, and thank you for commenting on Facebook. I'm interested what
I'd like to hear what she says.
Should have been done. Yeah.
So I was the acting chief at the time. So Rebecca will probably give you a better perspective because she was closer to it. From my aspect, at the administrative end, we didn't have the problems that we anticipated. In other words, we didn't have the major incidents, but there may have been a lot of major incidents, rather, at the lower level that we could have done better.
But also, the weather was getting warmer.
Yeah.
People were going to use the green. They couldn't use the green.
Yeah.
They had all the tents up, and it wasn't necessarily safe.
Well, you got to remember, too, and I don't mean, I'm not trying to project, but I left that January of 2012, and then Esserman came in and handled the back end of that. Right? So I'm not trying to put anything on him whatsoever at all.
Time, yeah.
I still think that from, a relatively, from the administrative level, it was handled well.
Well, what should have happened, like in Atlanta? It ended up in a shootout. What could it have done to make it not a shootout if the people in the trees?
I don't know the details of the actual shoot-on incident, and I would think I would have to know that before I commented on it. However, I do think that sometimes we have a tendency to, how should I say, we have a tendency to tell the public that we know what's best for them, right? And I think that that's a sentiment in policing that needs to really end. I think that that's a lot of the problems,
The final day I was asked to leave the area, and they went with force. I still don't agree to this day. That's interesting, Rebecca said, with force.
See, I didn't know
Harry
that.
says in Atlanta, the protesters shot a cop. Police returned fire. That's what they say. We don't know have any evidence that yet. They did not have body camera footage.
No body camera. Okay.
There was no body camera, which is very suspicious. They've been saying police need more training. Cops actually decide to help fund that facility, and they're the bad guys. He's starting with the Antifa thing. Okay, so he says it's the nutty group that goes in the trees. But what do you do when the group is someone that mainstream society considers nutty? How you deal with them? Whether it's January 6 protesters or people who refuse to leave public property.
You get to a point now where if it gets too out of control, there's really only one response. I mean, the reality is you have to restore order. If things are getting violent, people are being hurt. But before that, theoretically, you could sit and negotiate and speak and try and make people understand. Now, look, there are going to be people who are never going to understand.
It wasn't just their green; it's the public's green. But
you're talking about Occupy?
Both, or in the trees. I actually agree that they shouldn't build that facility. I'm sympathetic to the people who are in the trees, but I would never shoot a cop. But if they did that, but also, they don't really have a right to be up there. Now, there's a reason for civil disobedience when you think there's a larger cause. It got pretty. It got after Occupy for a few months. It got to be pretty far away from any.
Well, I think that's the thing, Paul. Is a lot of times, if you protest the right way, you'll be heard. But eventually, a lot of times, they devolve into something where there's no other alternative but to stop them and break them up, and then the cause is lost. Right. I think that was a mistake. However, you're engaging police officers and you're shooting them. You know what you're going to get in return with that. But the cause itself, right? I think that. I think we could be more sympathetic to a lot of these things. I will stick with a lot of times.
Well, I knew the cops dug the people. I didn't know any cop who was against what the Occupy people advanced. It just got to be a dangerous situation there.
Yeah, well, you know what it is? It's like everything else. There are some people that see an opportunity to use it to their own, fulfill their own agenda or do their own thing, and they cloud up everything and they make a mess of it, to be honest. It's as easy as that.
All right, we're talking with Criminal Justice Police, and thank you so much, Rebecca Sweeney, for writing in, Harry Drost as well. Some other issues. What do you think of the fallout from the Randy Cox case in New Haven? That's when the guy was arrested, put in the prisoner transport. They had no seatbelts. Now they do. He was banged around, got really hurt, and then the driver handled it wrong, didn't take him to the hospital, took him to lock up, and then they just did crazy stuff there. They dragged him across the floor after he'd been paralyzed. He was paralyzed the rest of his life. It looks like we're going to be bankrupted, maybe. I mean, it looks like they have settlement talks. They're going to go above the $30 million they were talking about. Yeah. How do you feel about how that's playing out? And they arrested the officers.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, they did,
and they're arresting a lot of officers that ain't used to arrest.
Right, but I think that's more of an example of where we are in society now. The chief in Atlanta got a lot of accolades for taking the quick action that she did, but I personally don't think that she's doing anything that Carl Jacobson isn't doing, and I don't think
he's going fast to take action.
Right, and I don't think either one of those two are doing anything that's accepted. That's what he has to do now, because this community is not going to accept anything other than that. Right. The days where you come out after a major incident like a Cox or a Tyree Nichols and you say, wait, we're going to investigate this for 2 years. That's not going to happen anymore.
So often I look at officers who do something wrong, and often they're really wonderful people who on other days have done things so well. I know there are people like that. There was a guy, they had to get rid of who was just mentally ill and just doing crazy stuff from day one to somehow stay on the force. But When I look at, for instance, the driver, he was a very good officer. There was a guy, Jason Santiago, who in the middle of like being harassed by a crowd and almost killed by a driver, went into a burning car to save his life.
Yeah.
And he also screwed up one day with someone who was difficult. I think it was Christmas or Thanksgiving Day, and hit him while he was in handcuffs. And now he's being criminally prosecuted. He lost his job.
Right.
And that's what's happening now. It didn't used to happen. How do you feel about that?
I think that's what should happen. I really do. I always have felt that way. I think that, there's a certain way to do this job, and if you break the law, then, you break the law. You're not above the law because you're a police officer. And yet you're
against getting rid of qualified immunity for cops.
Because I think that sends the wrong message. It opens up the door for a lot of frivolous litigation. That's my personal opinion.
But that's so odd because that's identified as the number one people who want police accountability in the country. They say the police unions through the politicians got this special protection for cops to break the law without any responsibility that nobody else has in other professions, and that's given them this carte blanche. Like I guess one way I think we don't agree is I think it's so hard to convict an officer, which is fine.
Right.
Because they are putting their life at risk, and you are responsible for how you train and supervise. The department should be on the line. But you really don't convict an officer unless they've done something so egregious.
Well, I don't think it's the presence of the doctrine that does that. I think it's the interpretation of the court. The court is very yes or no with it, where there's no gray area, right? They're very quick to say...
Juries sympathize with officers.
Right. Well, that used to be the case. Do they still sympathize with officers? I'm not so sure. However...
Ray Tennant got off.
Yeah, well, that's don't even get me going on that story. But anyway...
Well, but that happened.
It did. But he also... Wait a second. He also completed... what he needed to complete. So should he be treated like everybody else?
That had nothing to do with the criminal. That had nothing to do with the criminal stuff, and they stretched it out so that he could retire and get his full benefits.
Oh, well, we talked about that already. I'm the first person to agree with that, to be honest with you. But I think it's getting back to qualified.
But if anyone
immunity,
else in society, okay, yeah, right, okay, go ahead.
I think it's the application of that doctrine when it gets to court, because the judge decides whether it applies or whether it doesn't. And it's as simple as that. There's no real, there's no test to whether that should apply or whether that shouldn't apply, so to speak. Yes, there is. Was it a lawful action, stuff like that, but it's too vague, right? I think if you whittled it down a little bit and made it less ambiguous, it could be a very good. It could protect the good officers the way it's intended to, and still expose the bad officers, so to speak. I think right now there are too many bad officers that take advantage of it, and it's giving them a shield. And I agree.
That's not what I'm concerned about, because I'm not concerned about bad officers. I think every profession has a small percentage.
Well, how should I say, misbehaving officers?
Yeah, and I don't think we need to be arresting a lot of cops or use this.
No,
I just think
agree.
it's that special permission that that worries me. I don't know. I don't think most people should have to worry about getting arrested for doing their job.
Well, here's the thing with qualified immunity. We do ask the police to go out and do a very difficult job, and there are sometimes we put them in a position where they're going to have to do things.
And how they're trained in your former Scorpion unit, right? So there's I think there's an extra level in which there's criminal prosecution. I don't think we're going to see cops just prosecuted all the time, any more than a teacher.
But to go back, scroll all the way back. One, as administrators, right, and politicians, let's say, are we doing the right things by our officers? Are we training them the right way?
I agree. I agree. So maybe what we could agree with, maybe you agree with me not to have the qualified immunity. I agree with you that we should spend a lot for training, support, and that also that you don't always.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can agree with the no qualified immunity.
And that also, people can make mistakes and not always lose their job, depending.
I agree with that 100%. I think that officers are a commodity here. A trained officer, they take a lot of, not just the money, but it takes a lot of time, a lot of experience, and they're usually good people. The vetting process is very stringent.
I've been impressed by the new cops coming out. I kind of think we have an opportunity in New Haven.
I think we have a great department here in New Haven. I think people that, I hate to say,
we
sometimes...
We lost so much institutional knowledge.
You gained a lot. You gained, there's some real good cops
here. I've been meeting some of them and really been impressed with why they want to be officers, how they do their job. They span the spectrum of whether it's ideology or background. But there seems to be something about the people who came on during the pandemic that this was something very new. Like after the smoke cleared on all the protests and we had this whole new world.
They are, like I said, there's been incidents, but for the most part, they seem like good, intelligent, morally sound officers, and I think that's an important thing. Go back to with the training. We get all these hours on shooting and defense, but we get an hour on ethics and morality. That's a huge part of our job. Using discretion. Nobody even tells you that you can use discretion. That's kind of just something you do on your own, and nobody says anything, so you use your discretion, right? However, what do we look at these guys in Memphis? Did they do them a service by making a Scorpion unit and putting them in there and detailing them what to do? I can remember back in the 90s, sometimes the boss would say at the line, people's rights are suspended tonight. Go out and round up as many
say
people.
that?
Have you come over here?
That was a quote?
Yeah, that was back in the, like 93. That was. I was brand new on the job, and I was like,
What'd you think when you heard that?
I didn't think. I don't know. To be honest, I was a little nervous, but that's when it's so violent, and people were calling the PD and do something over here. That was the knee-jerk reaction, right? And they would just send you out. And what are you telling your officers? I mean, what's the message you're sending these guys? And a lot of these times, we don't spend a ton of time making sure these guys are constitutionally. We get updates in our in-service training, but we don't ever go off, the very basics, what we should have learned in the academy, a refresher. I mean, we get a little bit, but we don't get enough, right? And then, to be honest with you, I'm going to go back to what Rebecca said at the very beginning of this. Supervision is key. We have supervisors out there that are afraid to do their jobs because they don't want these cops to dislike them. As you know me, I never had a problem with somebody disliking me if I'm doing the right thing by the department, right? A lot of these guys and women, they don't want to enforce these regulations on the officers, so the officers continue the bad behavior, and eventually that misconduct becomes corruption. Everything moves up a notch, right? Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of things that we can handle at the lowest level, and we decide not to. They turn into these huge things.
Before I let you go, so we had the first month of this year, after homicides dropped last year, we had 5 homicides, which obviously is a rate far beyond what we've known. When's the last time New Haven had that kind of rash of homicides?
When I was the assistant chief in charge of the bureau, 2011.
12 years ago.
Yeah, and then we came off of a year where we were very low. 2010, I believe we had 8, maybe. And we were very low, and everybody was, or I think it was 2007.
That's the thing about numbers. So then that got used as, so how many did you have in 2011? I remember.
We had 36.
I remember there was one string, and the numbers, since we're a smaller city, those numbers dramatically swing. So whenever our crime went down after that, people pointed to that one high number to have the percentage
and they used
drop.
that. Crime was dropped, yeah.
But I remember, once there was an incident at I think a laundry, in a commercial laundry, not like where you go to coin op, in the Hill, where there was a workplace dispute and a triple homicide, and then there was a tit for tat in Fairhaven with a drug dealer mad at the family. And just that alone made the numbers go huge.
Well, that's, this is something I've been saying for years, and this. This is something I said in 2011 as well. If you have one incident with 3 homicides, my personal opinion is that should be counted as one incident, right? Because it gives the false impression that, an area is plagued by a lot more homicides. Even just like in this 5
homicides in January, and we had 0 in January the year before.
Right.
We had more shootings in the January from the year before.
Right. So
more people got shot.
Yeah. So what makes
but 5 died. So
shot placement was different.
And obviously we care about people's lives and everything. But right. So that's what I wear. These small numbers, we kind of have a hard time getting the big picture. But it's real and it matters.
Sure. But I would also every
how
time
do we
talk
judge
about
it? Is what
numbers,
I'm guessing. Yeah.
If we're going to look at statistics, which I could tell you from being in management for 20 years now, statistics can be whatever I want them for you to see. If it depends on. Just give me enough time and I can figure it out. Okay,
use a different baseline, yeah.
And that's the reality of the situation. Outside of the fact, how can you gauge violence in this city by the lowest reported violent crime? I mean, if you're going to gauge violence, I would say take all the violent crime, exclude the homicides. Talk about robberies and sexual assault, and then you could get a good barometer on how violent the city is. But I think homicide numbers, with regard to violence, we
in the media are. Share responsibility for that misperception.
Well, people want to know homicide numbers, right? And that's the thing, so we give them to them.
All right. Well, John Velleca, thanks so much for clearing up mysteries and tackling the tough issues.
Sure.
So we love having you in here as our criminal justice expert of WNHHM. Thanks Rebecca and Harry for your comments. Thanks for listening in. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free from the group CD A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to fly free with us all day and all night at WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.